Good evening, everybody. My name is Tracy Inman, and I am the Associate Director at the Center for Gifted Studies at Western Kentucky University. And if you've been with us during these parent seminars, this makes the 6 out of 7. Um, for those of you who are interested, you can go to the YouTube channel with JCPS Schools and look at the other ones if you happen to miss them. Tonight, we're going to focus on a very specific type of learner, and that's the 2E learner, also known as the twice exceptional learner, the multi-exceptional learner. It's had some different terms along with it, but we're going to really try to explore what are the best ways to parent this very unique, exceptional child. I want to start off with a poem that was written by a twice exceptional student. A bad year without bad people, really. No one exactly to blame, just a sequence of events, a class that didn't belong to me, and I not belonging to it, the round peg in the square hole. As words sprang and papers vanished, I became more and more confused, and most of all, sad. So the round peg found a round hole. So the story ends. At least it was without villains. And I think this poem does a really nice job of explaining how many twice exceptional children feel, and that is that they don't belong anywhere. They're too different from other gifted children to fit in. They're too different from other children who have been diagnosed with learning disabilities or some other type of difficulty, and they don't fit in. And they're too different from regular kids too, the normal kids, right? So um, it's tough to be different from other children who are like you, who are in the same grade as you and that sort of thing. So we're going to kind of look at what are some of these differences and how can we as parents help to make that road a little smoother. I'll let you read this one. That's a powerful statement. Um, but we have to lift that mask. We've got to start focusing on who is that child individually and get rid of the mask that has all those different labels on it. So one of those labels is twice exceptional. And I've mentioned that that means you have two different kind of exceptionalities. You're gifted, but what does that even mean? Well, that depends on what state you live in. There's a federal definition, but all 50 states look at gifted differently. What does disability mean? Now, we do have a federal definition of disability, so those are a little bit more uniform. And by the way, there's lots of federal money available for those with disabilities. The federal money isn't available for those with gifted. Here's a picture of a child who has multiple exceptionalities, and I want you to pay close attention to that top left picture as she's pulling her hair out. So often, this is how children feel. There's this huge frustration, especially if they haven't been identified yet. Claire Hughes, the person who wrote this quote, she has two twice exceptional children, and she has some tricks that she's discovered. I'm going to share some things with Claire as we go along. And Claire's interesting because not only is she the parent of twice exceptional children, but she is a professor in special education and gifted education. And she says, parents, keep showing them being the teacher. Show them examples of your child's ideas. Remind teachers of gifts and emphasize that you're trying to help develop those, not cure her disability. Can't cure disabilities, right? You can develop coping skills. And when children go to school and the only thing that is focused on are their disabilities, who wants to be in school? I mean, you and I, we don't get jobs in the areas that are our weaknesses. We find professions and passions in those areas that we love. And for twice exceptional children, those passions are there, the gifts are there. So we have to switch it around and stop thinking in a deficit way of what the child can't do, but focus on what the child can do. So in the state of Kentucky, children with gifts and talents are exceptional learners under the law. So that means special education children are exceptional children. Gifted education children are exceptional. Exceptional means they learn different from the norm. Doesn't mean they're better, worse, deserve more, deserve less. It just means that they differ from the norm. So with that comes all the rights and responsibilities that happens with special education students. For example, an individual education plan, grievance procedures, all those different kinds of things. Let's look at some of these. In Kentucky, children can be identified in 5 different areas for gifted education. And the first is general intellectual. This is the ability for a child to do well in all subject areas. Now, it doesn't mean the child does well in all subject areas, right? It's just the ability to do so. And typically, this is associated with IQ, and that's how we tend to identify children. Now, I'm not saying that's the best way to do it, but that is how we look at it, that the child is in the staying on like the upper 96% of children. So this child has the ability to do well in all subject areas. The second type of giftedness is called specific academic aptitude. And that will be for the children who may be they're excellent in math, but maybe right at grade level in reading or even below grade level in reading. So it's going to be one of those subject areas that the child really stands out in. And we're looking for like the top 96% of those children too, or rather the top 4% when you look at it, 96th percentile. That's what it's called. So these are the kids that we tend to do pretty well by in school. Teachers differentiate, hopefully, they differentiate for all children, including those upper level kids. But the last few, we don't tend to do so well. And I'm talking nationwide with these areas. The next one is creativity, also called productive thinking. And creativity, this is not that I'm going to produce something creative like a short story or a picture. This deals with the thinking. So I'm thinking differently from other people. And our creative thinkers, quite honestly, those are going to be the ones who are going to solve the world's problems because they're going to approach it from different perspectives. And that's what's really needed. These children tend not to do very well in school. In fact, creativity levels are pretty high for all kids who are before they start kindergarten. It goes in a downward curve at kindergarten. There's another slump at 4th grade, kind of bottoms out at 7th grade. So we've got to try to encourage creative thinking as much as we can. Fourth area is leadership. And these are the children who have the ability to lead others. They have followers. It's a natural gift that they have, but of course, it needs to be developed because a leadership student may be someone in high school who is fighting hunger during COVID-19, setting up stations for people to come and get food, working with restaurants to have that donated. Or it could be the high school student who has the most lucrative drug operation. Those are both leaders, but we've got to make sure we're developing them in the right way. The last area are visual and performing arts. So these will be our artists, our musicians, our actors, our dancers, etc. So realize that you could be identified as gifted in one of these or any one of these to be identified as gifted. Whether it's multiple or just one, you still have all those rights and regulations that go along, rights and responsibilities that go along with it. Now, as far as disabilities are concerned, there is a federal definition and there are 13 different disabilities. And I'm going to kind of put these out here for you. And we might not necessarily going to talk about these individually because many people tend to be quite familiar with these. The specific learning disability, I think, is one that when we think of disabilities and school, that comes to mind first because we're looking at children who have problems processing language or numbers, writing. ADHD, we're pretty familiar with that, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. There's autism. You can have emotional disabilities, language. You've got hearing impaired, deafness, blindness, orthopedic impairment. So that might be you're in a wheelchair, traumatic brain injury. There's all different kinds of those. And each one of these, just as each one of the categories in gifted, causes the child to have needs that are exceptional, that are very different from other kids. And when we look at twice exceptional children, it comes in many shapes and forms. So you might have a student who's gifted mathematically, but with a severe speech impediment, or maybe somebody who's gifted in creativity and language arts and social studies, but who's deaf and blind. How about the artist who's on the autism spectrum disorder? maybe an intellectual disability. Imagine how that child does not thrive in school, because very rarely do we ask students to illustrate or draw what you know about this topic. Most of our assessments are pen and paper, multiple choice, short answer, those kinds of things. So it's very important that we allow differentiated assessments as well as much as we can. So many different combinations. And you know what? Each one of these differs from the others. They have different needs. It's pretty overwhelming for a teacher as well. And for the parent at home, when you're dealing with a child who has these exceptionalities, it can be overwhelming at times. You want what all parents want for their children, right? You want that success, personal success. You want the child to thrive. But when you have so many endless possibilities, it's pretty difficult. There's no one right way to identify these kids. There's just not. And there's no one right way to serve them. And when we talk about serving them, that's those learning opportunities that we give them to make sure they're learning. There's no one right way to do it. Pretty recently, some folks got together and they formed a community of practice, and they called it the National Twice Exceptional Community of Practice. Because there had been so many different definitions and approaches to twice exceptional children, these folks decided to define what twice exceptional actually meant when we're looking at it. And this group was made up of psychologists and psychiatrists, of counselors, of teachers, administrators, just a wide variety of people, speech pathologists, PTs, OTs, all these folks who could come together and share their viewpoint so that you could get a very holistic account of what a twice exceptional learner is. And this is what they came up with. Now, for us to understand this, we're going to break it down. All right. And let's start with the first section of it. Twice exceptional individuals evidence, and that's at first level. Twice exceptional individuals evidence exceptional ability and disability, which results in a unique set of circumstances. Their exceptional ability may dominate, hiding their disability. Their disability may dominate, hiding their exceptional ability. Each may mask the other so that neither is recognized or addressed. Now, let's think about this for just a moment. There are actually 3 conditions of twice exceptionality, and let's look at each of those. At the far left, the exceptional ability is recognized first. So these are going to be children who their gifts are very evident, and early in school, they're going to be noticed by educators and noticed by parents at home. So you can look at some of the characteristics. The achievements noticed early, oftentimes this comes about in high verbal ability as you're looking at the vocabulary a child has. This child tends to try to compensate for whatever that learning issue is. In fact, the child might not even realize he or she has a learning issue. But coping skills are coming into play, especially because the child is bright. If you look at that third row, this child is very frequently passed over for special education support because oftentimes they're at grade level. So they're bright enough that they have coping skills that they appear as average or above average, but they struggle. And because that gift was recognized, when they're not performing, they're looked at as lazy. You're not even trying. What's wrong? You're underachieving. When in reality, they are doing everything they can to compensate for that learning disability. There's extreme frustration in these children. The second column, that disability is recognized first. So the child's going to struggle in school, and we're going to see big issues with looking very much like the child is under grade level. These kids are going to be acknowledged for what they don't do. That's what they're going to be noticed for, not what they can do, as in the column right before it, but for what they can't do. And they will be termed at risk because the school will be focusing on those deficits. They're going to look at basic skills over and over and over again instead of emphasizing the creative abilities and the strengths because they haven't recognized that there are strengths yet because they're focusing on the deficits. And for these children, they really have a hard time giving credit for anything they do. In fact, they call themselves dumb, I'm stupid. And if they do have something creative that comes out, it'll be a fluke. So you're dealing with very low self-esteem, knowing something's wrong, having difficulties dealing with it. Then the third condition of 2E is that they balance each other out. So they have that gift allows them to have coping skills so the disability is never acknowledged, but the disability pulls them down to the point where their gifts are never acknowledged and they look absolutely average. They'd be making B's and C's, and teachers don't even look at them because that's fine. It's average, that's fine. When in reality, if their strengths were being addressed and they had support for those difficulties, they could soar. So they're functioning at grade level, but that's really well below their ability level. So sometimes, though, we are going to see gifts emerge in very specific content areas, especially when we have non-traditional methods that are being used. So let's make this a little bit more real, okay? And we're going to look at 3 students, Pedro, Hadley, and Lance. Now, I'd like to start with Pedro. And I'm going to read to you a little bit about Pedro. Pedro, he is a 9th grader at a large urban high school, for example, like one in Louisville. He likes physical education and music classes, but he really enjoys his pre-engineering computer-aided design class, the CAD classes, and shows great aptitude. He participates on the school's football and track teams. And although he consistently earns average grades in all content areas, his teachers are frustrated because he often appears to be daydreaming or doodling, not following directions on how to do particular assignments, or he's always looking for but rarely ever finding his homework. His notebook is a disaster with scattered papers and no discernible system of organization. And this has caused him to get in great trouble numerous times due to missed deadlines on papers and projects. His English and history teachers have noted that he will contribute interesting insights or make connections between literature and historical events that other students miss or don't understand. But they also indicate how they are concerned because he disrupts the flow of the lesson by calling out the information or the answers. He's late for his first period math class 2 or 3 times a week because he stayed up too late and has overslept. At home, he likes to take apart old computers and small appliances and combine parts from them to make new devices. He often works past midnight if he's working on a new project. One of his creations was the basis for his science fair project last year, winning him first place. His content area teachers and other students were very impressed as they'd not seen evidence of that kind of performance from him before. And several teachers questioned if he really had done the work because it was so well done and more sophisticated than what he produces on a regular basis in class. Although his father sees great potential in Pedro, he's a single father who works 2 jobs. He has little time to meet with school personnel to discuss his son's mediocre performance and tardiness. So when we look at Pedro, we see that he's average, not doing so great in school, has very distinct interests outside of school, and can do pretty amazing things. Now think about him just a moment and think about those 3 conditions. Now let's meet Hadley. Hadley, she's an active, verbally precocious, and social 5th grader. She was identified for the gifted program for the primary talent pool. She was selected for that in 2nd grade and then formally identified as gifted in 4th grade. In both her general education class and the gifted pullout program, Hadley demonstrates creativity, curiosity, and advanced humor. She also has an excellent memory, as demonstrated by her ability to remember facts and details that she learns in lessons, particularly social studies. She has a strong sense of social justice and will come to the aid of students who are being teased on the playground or at lunch. She also becomes emotional when the television news describes children who are being abused or hurt by war or other similar circumstances. She was so upset about the fact that girls in Afghanistan were not being allowed to go to school that she persuaded her gifted resource teacher to support a fundraising activity for the students. Hadley developed a plan, organized the student activities, and demonstrated leadership abilities. She's popular with all of the students in both her classroom and the gifted resource room and is well liked by the teachers. Given that she's in the gifted program, her classroom teacher was surprised to see that her fall screening scores in reading placed her in the 40th percentile. Although the scoring does not put her at the at risk category, she's not demonstrating reading achievement commensurate with her intellectual ability. So we're seeing a discrepancy there, aren't we? Her math universal screening scores are in the 95th percentile, and her progress in class would indicate that the assessment is accurate. So she's right where she needs to be for a gifted child, in math wise, but certainly not reading. The teacher's concerned because she's noticed that although Hadley uses advanced and descriptive vocabulary when she's speaking, her writing does not demonstrate any of this verbal richness. Hadley's mother has, her writing is limited to short sentences, few descriptions, and basic vocabulary. Haley's mother has complained to the teacher that Hadley is overwhelmed by the amount of homework, particularly in social studies, even though it's the subject she loves. Her mother often finds Hadley playing games on her laptop rather than reading the textbook or doing the worksheet or homework questions. She frequently says she's finished her homework in school or makes up excuses. An assignment that should take her a half an hour may take her at least twice that time. Her teacher has also noticed that her pace is slow and labored. So here's a young lady whose gifts were recognized very early through her creativity, her excellent vocabulary, but we see at fifth grade problems starting, don't we? Now let's check out Lance. Lance is a second grade student who falls on the autism spectrum disorder. He spends half of his day in the special ed classroom where he receives reading and math instruction as well as social skills training. The other half of his day is spent in a second grade general education classroom with support from a paraprofessional for social studies and science. So that means someone is working right beside him in that regular ed classroom to help make changes for him so that he can excel. He's progressing at an average pace in reading, but he's still struggling with complex comprehension questions that require analysis and evaluation. So he can read the words, but they're not clicking. Lance likes school, and the teachers say that he works hard, but he finds it to be confusing and unpredictable, particularly when instruction or directions are presented orally with few or no visuals. When he's stressed or confused, he twirls his hair, flaps his hands, or begins to cry. His classmates usually don't pay attention to these behaviors. Although he sits with other students at lunch, he doesn't have many friends. He spends most of his recess time wandering the periphery of the playground, talking to himself. Lance says that he likes science class and demonstrates advanced knowledge and vocabulary in the area of botany and some aspects of biology. For example, after students read about places where plants and animals lived, his teacher asked the students what that was called. Several students answered that it was their environment. Lance, however, a second grader, remember, answered that it was a habitat because, as he explained, the word environment means a larger area. He said it was like the difference between house and neighborhood. He was insistent that everyone use the right word. At home, Lance has developed his own scientific lab in his bedroom with different types of plants growing on his windowsill and bedside stand. He's keeping a journal in which he draws diagrams and pictures of the growth and parts of each plant. His mother's surprised by the sophistication and accuracy of the drawings in his vocabulary. Not only does he know the scientific name for many plants, he insists on using them both in his journal and when he's speaking about his favorite topic. Lance enjoys reading nonfiction books about botany and plants and enjoys watching science programs on television about botany. So when we look at these three folks, and we remember that we have three different conditions for twice exceptional: those whose Giftedness is recognized, but not the disabilities. Those whose disabilities are recognized, but not the strength. And then those whose disabilities and abilities cancel each other out pretty much. So let's think about this for just a moment. Which one of these children is which? Which one of these children would represent that the gifts are recognized, but the disabilities are not? That's right, it's Hadley. And it's interesting because this is very typical. When children are in primary school and the beginning of intermediate, those gifts are very apparent because they're so different from their classmates. But it's middle school time when the breaks start hitting, because that's when they start getting overwhelmed with the amount of work of having to do the organization on their own, spending so much more time on homework than other kids, but they've got this disability that has not been recognized. How about the child whose weaknesses are the focus and not the strengths? Well, that's going to be Lance. His disabilities were recognized early on. And the teacher does think it's pretty impressive that he's using the word habitat, but does it say what the teacher does? Think of the learning opportunities he could have, how he could shine in that classroom if those gifts were played upon, and how you can help support those weaknesses through the gifts. And then Pedro, look at Pedro. Neither one's recognized. This young man's in high school. And when he does excel, the teachers think maybe he cheated. This reminds me of a young man named John. And I had John in high school, my advanced placement English course. And John was an average student. In class with discussion, he amazed me with how in-depth his analysis would be, how he'd make connections to other works that we've read or to other things he studied. But when it came time for essay writings, and if you're familiar with advanced placement literature class, that advanced placement test it's got 3 essays on it. So it's got to be an essay written class approach. C's, sometimes D's. Had a hard time putting all that information together in a cohesive way. Now, I was a young teacher and bells didn't go off for me as they do now, but I still remember that January day when John, this big hulking senior, comes up to me before school and he has tears in his eyes. And he said, "Ms. Inman, I just found out I'm dyslexic. I always knew I was smart, but there was just something holding me back." So here's a young man who went through 13 years of school before figuring out he's dyslexic. Imagine the frustration he would have. And with dyslexia, your numbers are switched and your letters are switched, right? The coding is a bit off in the brain and how it processes. So think of all the coping skills he had to have. Well, good story, good ending, because John, with that, had his way paid through college, and he is now a computer programmer earning probably a lot more money than most of us watching this. But that shows what can happen with children who struggle and the frustration. Now, remember, all this goes back to the community of practice that we're looking at, that definition. So that first paragraph, it talks about there are 3 conditions, and we've got to find those 2E kids in those 3 conditions. That's why it's so difficult to identify the children and why these are the kids who tend to fall through the cracks. So 2E students who may perform below, at, or above grade level, and that makes sense given what we know about them, they require the following. And this is where the definition has a whole lot of meat to it, where it differs from other definitions that basically said you've got an ability and a disability. Because this tells us that specialized methods of identification that consider the possible interactions of the exceptionalities are required. That means you can't use the traditional methods for identification. It's not going to be true. You're not going to find the cutoff scores that you want, because a student who, think about Hadley with her verbal ability and her reading scores and how low those were. She wouldn't have been identified as having gifts there, although she was gifted when it came to language arts. So you have to look at it a little bit differently. So let's look then at how Many schools deal with identifying children with special needs. You may have heard response to intervention. This has been around for oh, probably as long as your child has been in school. So, what does RTI mean, response to intervention? Well, this is a way to figure out children who need special support. So, when a teacher sees that a child is having difficulty failing in some ways, they're going to try to figure out what the problem is. So, they're going to put certain interventions in place. And that'll be in the classroom, right? And then if those interventions aren't working, then they might seek a professional's help to try to figure out what's going on. It used to be that to be identified with special education, one of the labels that they have, oftentimes they would look at a test score and look at what does the test say versus how you're really performing, right? Are you performing way below it? Or do your test scores, are there a big difference between, say, reading comprehension, understanding the reading, or just the fluidity of being able to read the words? But response to intervention assumes that failure indicates possible issues. Now, that's not true with gifted students. These kids, their strengths are going to bump them up, as we've already talked about it. And so they could easily be making passing grades, and you're not going to see that achievement. So, somebody who's twice exceptional with the response to intervention concept may not ever be recognized because they're not going to, those struggles will just seem like, oh, those are, it's an average student. So, response to intervention can actually work for gifted students as well as special education students in the sense that, everybody's in that bottom group, they're getting their needs met in the classroom through differentiation. But if those needs aren't being met, whether they're not challenging enough or there's too challenging, then special accommodations need to be made. And then if you still see issues, then you bring in the experts. And so this, although it could work, it was very frustrating for a lot of children. So in reality, when we look at that identification, when we're recognizing that there are gifts and we're recognizing that struggles are happening, we need to look at the characteristics. What are the behaviors of that student? What are the characteristics? What strengths does that child have? What challenges does the child have? So let's go back for just a moment and think about Lance. Lance was our second grader, remember? And he is on the autism spectrum disorder, right? So he has, one of his challenges would definitely be social skills. He's by himself in the playground. He might eat with people at lunch, but doesn't really interact with them very much. We know that he has difficulty in reading and math, right? Because he is in special education classes for those, not mainstreamed into a classroom. But his strengths are really there too. This is a young man who loves science. I mean, he has set up his own lab, you know, as a 7-year-old, using a journal and drawing pictures and citing evidence. Those strengths are amazing. So you have to look at the whole child. And parents, this is where you are really important because for many teachers, they are only going to be able to see what's in front of them in class, right? Because that's the evidence they have. They may even go back and look at records and things, but it's going to be compiled from what teachers and educators have put together, maybe counselors. If you see interesting things going on at home, make sure the teacher understands that. Make sure, Lance's teacher should know that he's got his own little laboratory at home. Just like Pedro's teachers, and Pedro's of the age actually where he could tell him himself, is that as soon as I go home, man, I'm taking computers apart. I'm building new things with that. So you've got to recognize what are the characteristics and behaviors as to strengths and challenges. And then it's that interaction. Okay. That's what happens where those strengths and challenges meet. And that's where the support has to be. That support has to hit the middle ground. You can't just look at one or the other. And that's what you're looking for with identification. It's going to be a little trickier because you're going to see both and they may be at odds with each other. After the presentation, I'm going to give the PowerPoint to JCPS. And with that, I'm going to include this handout that's the chart for the next two slides. And this is just a sampling of what some of those characteristics look like. And with this, we are going to look at the indicator on the left. That's the main concept that we're looking at that we see in class or at home. Then we're going to look at what does that look like with just regular gifted kids, but what would it look like with someone who's perhaps twice exceptional? And you're going to see that it looks very different. So learning. Typically gifted students, and this is if they're identified in specific academic or intellectual, okay? We're not talking about kids with leadership or anything, but in learning, students who are academically gifted, they're going to be able to possess the ability to learn things pretty quickly, and they're going to be able to retain that information. In fact, it may take them 2 repetitions, 3, for them to understand this difficult math concept, where it might take the person next to them 15. Now, they're all going to learn it, but it's just a different at paces. So gifted children tend to learn things very quickly with little repetition. Well, what happens if you're gifted, but you have a learning disability as well, or some other type of difficulty? Well, this child's probably going to learn basic skills uneasily. It's going to struggle trying to learn them. They may need specific strategies to help them learn those basic skills and information. And they're going to need numerous repetitions um, in innovative ways so that they can learn it. You can see how that might not look like the child's even high ability, right? How about verbal ability? Well, if we think about Hadley, she had an extremely advanced vocabulary. And most gifted children who are gifted academically really do have a large verbal ability, large vocabulary. Now, of course, realize there's some students who won't learn to read until, you know, 3rd grade that can be gifted, but typically kids are who have a high vocabulary, a large vocabulary, excuse me, tend to be high ability. But if you're 2E, that's not the case. You may indeed have that high verbal ability, but when it comes to writing, you're going to have a really hard time with it. And that's what Hadley did. Remember how frustrated she would get. You could use language in inappropriate ways. You could use it at inappropriate times and not understand that it is inappropriate. How about those organizational skills? Well, for gifted students, quite honestly, organizational skills are all over the place, and gifted students tend to be very intense, right? So you are probably going to have students who color code their socks at home, right? And then you're going to have students who can't find a pair of socks that match because they're all over the room, right? So it's one extreme or the others. But when it comes to twice exceptional children, it tends to be a huge struggle with organization. And that's not just with things like socks, it's struggling to organize ideas in the mind, struggling to organize time. So you may need a schedule that helps them see when things are due and when they need to read to be ready for what's happening next. Attention spans. With gifted children, they tend to be pretty long, and at times they can just have tunnel vision, very intense, persistent concentration, and you're waving your hand in front of their faces to get their attention, right? With children who are twice exceptional, attention is oftentimes affected. And they too may have strict tunnel vision with things of their interest, but oftentimes children are going to go from thing to thing to thing, where it's difficult for them to be able to focus. So realize that oftentimes that happens with gifted kids too, because their attention, they have different interests. So they're really into this. Oh no, now I want to learn about this. So you kind of need to be careful when you look at those. In fact, there are oftentimes students who are gifted who may be misdiagnosed as having ADHD. In reality, they're just gifted because they go from thing to thing. But when you're twice exceptional and attention is one of those areas, it's going to be strongly affected. Observational skills, gifted children tend to have very keen powers of observation. And you're going to see strong observation skills in twice exceptional children, but they may be able to remember them. They're noticing it, they may talk about it, but they might not be able to recall that. Risk taking. Typically, gifted children take risks, whether they're academic risks or physical risks. It's part of that challenge of learning. With twice exceptional children, they're very unwilling typically to take risks, especially when it comes to anything with academics or in their areas of deficits. So if you're thinking about mobility issues or things like that. It's interesting though, because when you get out of those non-academic areas, out of the academic areas, you see that they do tend to take risks when it's not associated with their academics or with their area of disability. Independence is another trait. Gifted children seem to have a strong sense of independence and self-efficacy, meaning they have confidence that they can do things. That is not the case with many of our twice exceptional children. In fact, they need feedback. Sometimes they need step by step. How's it going? This is what I'm doing. They can be highly independent in other areas, but oftentimes in academic areas, they're not. And sometimes they come across as very stubborn or inflexible. As I mentioned, you'll have another list of these characteristics, but it's very interesting as you go down through these to see how easy it is to miss these kids, right? In the classroom. This is Claire again, and Claire's talking about her twice exceptional daughter. She's a gifted young lady with high functioning autism. One of my greatest joys was having her giftedness be so significant that it helped her work around her autism. Incredible mimicking skills equals social success. So as an autistic young lady, she mimicked other people. She mimicked what they did in social situations. And the students couldn't tell the difference. In fact, she was so gifted that she ended up going to a boarding school for gifted young ladies. And it was when she was there with other kids like herself that she really blossomed and became who she is now. Let's look at that next section. TUI students who may perform below, at, or above grade level require enriched, advanced educational opportunities. And these should develop the child's interests, gifts, and talents while also meeting the child's learning needs. And this is tricky. So your child has been identified as being twice exceptional. Well, we've got multiple things going on, right? We've got this advanced interest, whether that's botany or science, taking things apart, right? But we've got something holding them back. We've got to meet those needs. So what's our answer? Our answer is looking at a strengths-based approach. And wouldn't that be awesome if all school were strengths-based approach? So notice the cogs, and one's going to turn the other. The largest one, though, is developing the gift, honing the talent, right? But to do that, we have to manage the disability. We are not going to be able to take someone with a huge disability and erase it, right? That's not, these people are hardwired. Now, I'm not saying you can't get a cochlear implant for someone who's hard of hearing, but typically these are lifelong struggles, correct? So what we want to do is manage that disability so we can keep working on that strength that we're looking at success. So what does that look like? Well, differentiation is where you may be teaching the same concept, but you're going to change how you teach it or what level you teach it on, depending on the student's needs. So we're going to look at how, on the one hand, in the blue, strengths and interest accommodation. These are the strengths. We've got to be building those up. And in the red, we've got the challenges. What needs to have remediation? What kind of accommodations and modifications do we need? So when we're looking at the strengths, one of those, and we'll just go with the top one here, acceleration. That could be grade skipping, but acceleration is also, it could be subject acceleration, where the child may be doing 6th grade math as a 4th grader. So the child's accelerating in his areas of gifts. The math, think about the math level that Hadley was on. This child could have differentiated instruction. That means that instead of going to the 5th grade teacher or 6th grade teacher for math, that math would be done in a small group in the classroom. Hopefully there is content extension, which means let's think about Lance when he's looking at the botany, and he is way beyond where the other kids are when it comes to just vocabulary, right? That he would perhaps be able to go deeper or in a different direction when they're studying plants than the other kids would do. We also want to focus on higher order thinking skills. And again, we can use Lance for that because he is ready to process things at very high levels, right? Or think about certain areas. Or if we think about Pedro, who was made connections that other kids didn't make, he needs to be able to make those connections, to have questions asked of him that push him to make those connections. And what's incredibly important is that affective guidance and counseling, that affective where we're dealing with emotions, right? I have these disabilities. It's part of who I am. How do I cope with that? Why does it make me feel different? What are strategies I can use, right? It's that whole person that we're looking at. The whole child is so important. So, in twice exceptional children, we need to be developing that strength as best we possibly can. At the same time, we have to manage those disabilities. We have to support the student. And this is where we see some of those on the right hand side. And I'm going to start with the affective guidance and counseling. That is just as important. So, when we're dealing with, for example, affective guidance with, let's do Hadley, who's really shining in math, a lot of times middle school girls get really dumb in middle school, especially when they're gifted, because they don't want to be too different from other people, maths and sciences. That tends to where that tends to be one of the areas where they kind of dumb down. So for the affective guidance for Hadley, she needs to be studying amazing female mathematicians and astronauts, right? But the affective guidance and counseling to support that disability is going to look a little different from that. Compensatory strategies need to be taught. This is a coping skill that you can use. It's called chunking or whatever the skill is going to be. It could be that they actually needs very specific programs and tutoring. A specific program for Lance was going to the other classroom, right, the special ed classroom. Um, the very bottom says differentiated instruction, which was also a strength. But this differentiation, we're going to make accommodations, right? We're going to change how the child is learning about it or the level the child's learning about it so that to support the issues. And small group direct instruction, I'm going to maybe pull kids together who are at the same level with that and have them do something different. And that could work for both. So realize that there are so many things that could be happening in your schools to support the child's needs when it comes to the disabilities, but also really challenging and pushing and nurturing that the areas of strength so we see growth. Michaela Brancamonte actually founded a 2E school out in California, and it has great success. And she argues, nurture the student's strengths and interests, foster her social emotional development, enhance her capacity to cope with mixed abilities, identify learning gaps, and provide explicit remediative instruction, support the development of compensatory strategies. These are all things that could be done to help the child excel. The enriched educational supports was the second, and at the same time, 2E students require simultaneous supports, as we talked about, that ensure the child's academic success and social emotional well-being, such as accommodations, therapeutic interventions, and specialized instruction. So simultaneous supports, it's happening the same time as the enriched opportunities. And it's helping the child reach academic success, helping the child learn strategies to cope with the academics and the areas that are very challenging. Social emotional well-being is so incredibly important. And most of the phone calls I get from parents with gifted children and twice exceptional children, it stems from social emotional issues that they're trying to address. And what would these two, the supports look like for academic success and social emotional well-being? Accommodations. You're going to change things. You're going to tweak them, alter them. Therapeutic interventions. Maybe the child's going to be working with an occupational therapist to develop some fine motor skills. Maybe it's specialized instruction where the child may be pulled out to go to the gifted resource teacher and also pulled out to go to the special education resource teacher. It's going to be a combination of those things because if you remember at the beginning when we looked at all those different areas, no child is the same, right? And that's a beautiful thing, but it's challenging for classroom teachers. Working successfully with this unique population requires specialized academic training and ongoing professional development. Now, luckily, all of the teachers in all the public school teachers in Kentucky have had training in exceptional children, exceptional learners. Unfortunately, that tends to focus on the disability area and not the strength. Most teachers, and not just in Jefferson County, but in Kentucky and in the United States, have had no formal training with gifted education. And there are pockets here and there. And I'm thrilled to say that JCPS is now paying for teachers to go through a cohort to earn a gifted endorsement where they're getting 12 graduate hours in gifted education, learning all about 2E children and all the other aspects of it, and then taking a test to get their endorsement on the state level. So it requires training because this isn't something that just comes naturally to folks. And that means a plan. And again, this is where you come into play. A plan for your child needs to be comprehensive in nature. That means it needs to be very thorough, focusing on gifts as well as challenges. It needs to be for your child and not every child who happens to be gifted in math, right? Or not for every child who happens to be blind. It's got to change. It has to be flexible. And you have to look at the whole child. And remember, that's not just the cognitive part, the social, emotional, physical, all of those things are important. But it takes a team to make that happen. And for those of you who have children who are identified with a disability of some sort, that child already has an individual education plan, an IEP, and there's a team that meets with those kids, right? If your child has been formally identified as gifted, the child should have a gifted student service plan, which is an IEP. An individual education plan, it just has different letters with it. And the team should also be doing that. When you have a child who's twice exceptional, that should be one plan. And personally, I tend to recommend that it goes with the special education IEP simply because that has a lot more funding behind it, more sharper legal teeth behind it. So who should be part of that team? All the people who come in contact with your child. Special educators, gifted, general. Depending on the needs of your child, you might need a physical therapist or a mental health expert. The counselor of the school. So important. The family members, the adults in that child's life. And if the child is of age, and that's probably middle school, the child should be a part of that team as well. And hopefully by high school, that child is leading the meetings as it goes on. So collaborating as partners in this team, that means you're going to examine the data. What information do you have on your child? You're going to develop and implement the interventions. So what is going to work with your child? What type of strategies should be used? Interventions. You're going to monitor the progress. Is it working? Is it not working? And evaluate how effective it is. So evaluating the effectiveness, if it's not working, let's back up and do something else. You know, he had an independent study and he doesn't have the organizational skills to make it happen. So what can we do? So the most important elements to achieve success is you've got to have clear communication. Let's face it, people who are in education, we love children, right? We're in it because we love kids. We want them to succeed. We want them to be lifelong learners. We've got to work together, right? So we've got to talk together. And that means for educators, we don't use all the jargons like IEPs and things that the parents, well, you can use it, but you've got to make sure parents understand the vocabulary. So that common language is really important. And we need to know what those roles are. So when you have that, research has told us that twice exceptional students can feel more consistently supported, both at school and home, when that ownership is shared. Twice exceptional students are at increased risk for failure and underachievement without a partnership with families. That partnership is so important. Now, I mentioned to you RTI, response to intervention, and that was a way that schools looked at it for, well, a couple of decades. Now you may be hearing the terms multi-tiered system of supports, and that is replacing the concept of RTI, although it's pretty similar. RTI looked for problems first, right? This is looking at it more holistically. So this is an infrastructure, right? So you've got lots of different people. It's the system of the school. So it's going to be a supportive infrastructure providing personnel preparation. That means we're training our people on what to look for, on how to handle this. The infrastructure, the school is going to have policies that are in place, and it will set aside time to be able to have the meetings and the planning that goes on, because those just don't happen in school by themselves. So a multi-tiered and MTSS, right? The first real support you're going to have is a supportive infrastructure that allows all this to happen. Then there's a tiered approach for support is going to be offered to all students, especially those who have diverse learning needs. So you might have increased time of duration, increased time of intensity, time spent with it. Then problem solving happens. And that problem solving process allows for discussion of the whole child, starting with the strengths, right? So these are the positives that we're seeing. How can we use these to help solve? These are the strengths that we're seeing. How can we use these to solve the problems? So this multi-tiered system, the infrastructure, right? We've got all this in place, helping the child to be the best the child can be. It provides an ongoing discussion about each student's needs, and it's not necessarily pushing for the child to get tested for special needs. It's, well, i.e., that is, interventions can occur without a label. So in an ideal situation, you're going to have a system in place that will look at the strengths and the challenges for all children, right? When those are intense and atypical from the norm, they're going to especially be procedures in place, policies in place for those to be addressed, right, in a very systemic way. And so the strengths will be used to help the child soar, to help the child deal with the difficulties, with the disabilities that might be there. And no labeling occurs as gifted or special ed or something like that. Now that's an ideal system. As you're looking for your plan through that MTSS system, take into account your child's characteristics. And those are the characteristics of giftedness, along with the characteristics of twice exceptionality. And remember, you're going to have that listing that can help you with that. But there are also lots of other lists. You can look checklists for different types of characteristics. Focus on the strengths and interests. Find out what those are. There's Interestalizer, there are strengths tests, there are all kinds of online surveys and assessments that educators have access to that can help you figure out what are the strengths. What are the areas of need? And this may need, for the strengths and the learning needs, this may require some formal testing to figure out what those areas are. What are the social emotional needs? And you talk to the child, what makes you angry? When do you find yourself most frustrated? What makes you happy? You focus on what are the needs that the child has. It might be perfectionism, right? It could be any number of things, but you've got to figure out what those needs are, because how can you plan for something if you're not aware of it? So let's look at Lance. When we looked at all these things with Lance, we see that he has lots of characteristics, right? We know that one characteristic is that he's kind of a loner, right? Another characteristic is that he has delight when it's something of his passion. Another characteristic is he likes things to be precise. There is a word for habitat, and that's what you're supposed to use, right? Think about the strengths that he has and the interests, the botany, right? The science. Those seem to be his greatest strengths and his greatest interests. What are the challenges that he has? Well, we know he struggles with autism. And with that is going to come social skills that he will need to be trained in how to make that happen. He struggles with understanding what he's reading. He struggles with schedules that aren't predictable. What are the social emotional needs of Lance? He needs friends. He needs a friend, right? He needs to not be alone every recess. He may need to be alone some recesses because that alone time is important to him, but not all the time. He may need help in figuring out when he gets stressed because he does physical outbursts. And when you're in second grade and you cry and do those things, the second graders, that's not that big of a deal. Seventh grade, that's a big deal. So he needs to find coping mechanisms too. To look at the whole child is the way that we develop the best plan for Lance and the way that we developed the best plan for your child. 1 million of our nation's most promising, most innovative thinkers, bright children who learn differently, not deficiently, constitute a neglected national resource. Think about that. 1 million. That's the estimate of how many twice exceptional children there are. Twice exceptional children need an education that fits, and it's in all of our interests to give it to them. I want to share with you a TED Talk by Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman. And he's going to talk about how intelligence needs to be measured in different ways. But I want you to see that he spends quite a bit of time talking about twice exceptional children. And I'm sharing this with you because I think it's very enlightening. But I also think as you're watching it, especially with those of you who have later elementary kids, middle and high school, be thinking, is this something that could help my child?
I would like to offer you today a broader definition of human intelligence, one that I think takes into account the whole person, both our deepest challenges as well as our most profound strengths. I believe our standard model of intelligence is systematically letting far too many kids fall between the cracks in an educational system that has such limited notions of human potential. Let me share with you 2 school evaluations that I think do a nice job illustrating this point. So this one is a middle school assessment about a quiet but friendly and hardworking young man who's enrolled in a small private academy. Depending on the subject, he works at a variety of different grade levels. His teachers report he is a willing participant in every facet of school and becomes fervent, even obsessive, about activities of particular interest. Showing superior grasp of academic concepts in his homework, class discussions, and projects, he occasionally suggests alternatives to teacher-directed assignments so that he can demonstrate his comprehension and skill. As a result, his relationships with peers, older students with mutual interests, and adults continue to improve. Okay, now I want to show you another school evaluation about an 8-year-old boy who was referred to a neurologist. According to this neurologist, information provided by mother and observations in the office setting indicate that difficulties displayed have a multifactorial basis, including attention deficit hyperactive disorder, mild oppositional defiant disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and mild unevenness in skill development. Now, I want to ask you all a question. Raise your hand if you thought I was talking about 2 completely different children. So I see some hands here. I mean, would it surprise anyone in this room to know that this was actually the same kid, Blaine, at different points in this kid's life? One when he was 8 years old and one in middle school. Do you think, just looking at this report, by the way, these are the recommendations of this kid. We have a whole bunch of things, including counseling, medication, social interventions, behavioral management. Is there anything in this evaluation that would allow you to predict this kid. I want you to think about that for a second. In recent years, a number of very thoughtful educators, clinicians, psychologists, and parents have identified the unique needs and learning styles of a particular classification of students called the twice exceptional student. So I want to tell you today about these twice exceptional students. What you find is that twice exceptional students simultaneously have exemplary strengths as well as extraordinary challenges. So you may see the child could have difficulty with written expression, high anxiety, could become easily frustrated, difficulty with social interactions, uneven academic performance, while also having a rich vocabulary, being resourceful, being curious, imaginative, creative, having a special talent or interest, all in a single package. Now, it's estimated there are about 300,000 of these kids in this country, but I think that's a gross underestimate for a number of reasons. For one, I don't think we fully realize that a lot of these challenges can be strengths in the right context, but I also think we have a really narrow notion of strengths to begin with. So I think in order to really find out how many of these kids are falling through the cracks and really get the best out of these students, I think we need to take into account a 4C model. So we need to take into account capacity, competence, commitment, and creativity. Importantly, they're not all the same thing. You do sometimes see them all in the same package, but I think it's really important to differentiate them from each other. So first of all, what is the difference between capacity and competence? Well, here's a chart of so-called one of our biggest metrics of potential, IQ, the IQ test. Most of you heard of the IQ test. It's supposed to forecast your ability to achieve academically on actual competence tests of standardized achievement. And what you see here is, yeah, it's true. IQ does correlate with standardized achievement. I'm not saying that IQ is a useless measure of potential in academics. But what you see here is that about 50% of individuals are underperforming based on their predicted measure of potential. And often unrecognized, 50% are overperforming based on their predicted measure of human potential. That often is not made nearly as much. We need to leave much more room in our models in school for children to surprise us. Something is clearly not complete here in our understanding of human intelligence. But if we just stop there, there's obviously more to getting out of seeing possibility in children than just their academic performance, their capacity, or even their competence. We also have commitments. You see kids in special education have so many commitments, so much values. They have so many values and passions for special interest areas, for things that they're, for making the world a better place. I think something is deeply flawed with an education system where if a child comes to you and says, look, I'd really like resources to end violence or end bullying or to develop my musical talents, et cetera, that we say, hold on, we have to measure your IQ or look at your standardized test to see whether or not you score above a certain threshold in order to make the world a better place. I think something is deeply flawed with the system where we don't just immediately say, great, how can we help you get there? And in addition to commitment, I also see creativity as extraordinarily important. You find that creativity often comes in the most unexpected packages. So you see these kids right here, these happy, engaged group of kids. Well, these are kids on the autism spectrum. Now, according to a lot of popular notions of autism, they're not capable of deep social interactions and bonding. But what you find when you actually work with kids in the autism spectrum is that they crave connection. They deeply crave connection. And my colleague Matt Lerner has been designing these improv exercises that puts them in this kind of situation where they can be funny with each other, where they can really bond with each other and meet fun ways, and finds that instead of the social awkwardness that a lot of what maybe referred to as neurotypical people would call social awkwardness among people on the autism spectrum, actually it's completely reframed as social creativity in this context. And they are genuinely creative in this context. I don't know about you, but I would much rather be called socially creative than socially awkward, at least have that framing. So I really do believe we need a new theory of human intelligence, one that is more holistic and takes into account a child's passions, personal goals, as well as their ability level. Because the more that we engage and are motivated to achieve, the more that increases our actual ability. And the more the ability achieves, it then becomes an upward spiral, where then our engagement is greater as well. And then most importantly, once it's connected to a personal passion or dream, then we can start to realize real possibilities. possibility we have. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that this is deeply personal for me. When I was a child, I was diagnosed with a learning disability called central auditory processing disorder. It made it very difficult for me to process information in real time, and I was held back in third grade. As a result, a lot of the kids and teachers thought they took my slowness as an indicator of being stupid. And I was kept in special education until ninth grade, when a teacher took me aside and she said, I see you. I see your frustration. Why are you still here? And she inspired me. I realized I had no good answer to that question, and she inspired me to see what I was what was I capable of? Could my capability exceed my capacity that everyone was telling me? And so I took myself out of special education. I signed up for lots of classes. I joined the school orchestra, I joined the choir. By my senior year, most of my friends were in gifted education. And I wanted to be in gifted education. I went to the school psychologist and I said, I would love to, my senior year, be in gifted education. And he said, well, you look gifted. That's good. Good start. I told him I'm getting straight A's. I'm getting straight A's in all my classes. He said, that sounds gifted as well, but I have to see if you're actually gifted. I need to look at your IQ score when you're age 11. So he pulled out my test, my score at age 11, which turned out that my measured IQ at age 11, I've never revealed this in a talk, was borderline mentally, intellectually impaired. And he took out a bell curve and he said, look, up here on the right, these are the kids who are in your gifted class. These are all your friends, basically. To the left here, about in the center is about average. And he moved to the left of the bell curve and said, this is you. I'm sorry you don't qualify for gifted education. I was so upset and shy at that moment, and I just remember thinking to myself, gosh, at what point is my achievement allowed to trump my potential? When I'm actually doing it, at what point can that trump what was measured as my potential? I knew at that moment that I wanted to do something to change the system. And I applied to Carnegie Mellon University and put in a personal statement. And I said, look, I really want to change our metrics of human potential. And I think far too many people are falling between the cracks in terms of our standard models. And they rejected me to Carnegie Mellon. They said, sorry, your SAT scores are not high enough to redefine intelligence. Again, I was rejected because they were looking at my SAT scores potential over what I was trying to show them right in front of their face. So I looked at the different departments at Carnegie Mellon to see which ones don't look at SAT scores. And I found the opera department. I went in the following week, did not tell the opera department I was already rejected by their university. And I said, hi, I just love opera and I'd like to audition. And I sang Stars from Les Miserables, sang my heart out. And they accepted me on a partial scholarship to Carnegie Mellon University for my singing ability. Apparently, the departments don't talk to each other very much. I was just rejected. Once I got to Carnegie Mellon, I should say it's a lovely department, no disrespect, but I endured a full semester of dance classes and ballet and acting classes. I'm a terrible actor. Singing classes, not a terrible singer. And I went in second semester, freshman year, to the psychology department at Carnegie Mellon. My heart beating so fast, trying to pretend I haven't been planning this my whole life. And I walked into the department, and the secretary was there eating a bologna sandwich. And I said, hey, I just took a course in psychology. I loved it. Do you think maybe I could be a minor in psychology? It's called foot and door technique. You start small and work out. And she's like, whatever, like, no one's ever been as excited to be a minor in psychology at Carnegie Mellon. She's like, just sign this paper. And I remember as I was skipping back to my door in my tights, because I'd just come from dance class that day, I remember thinking to myself, with this paper in my hand, my gosh, this is all it came down to in life, was finding a way to sign the paper, to get to that space where there was high expectations for everyone, where everyone just saw a different aspect of me. And there was no question. All she wanted to do was finish her bologna sandwich. She didn't ask to say, well, I'm sorry, let me see, what are your SAT scores? Or sit down and let me have you take an IQ test. No, I was there. I had figured a strategy through my commitment and creativity to get there. And once I was there, it didn't matter anymore what my potential was. So, following following semester, I went back to the same secretary. I think somehow she was still eating the same bologna sandwich. I don't know how that's possible, but I said, look, I would like to be a major in psychology. I took another course, and it was just even better than the first. Who knew this department would have such a good psychology department? And she said, oh, you just sign these 2 pieces of paper, and you can have whatever you want. So I changed my major to psychology, and then working my way up, I graduated Phi Beta Kappa, straight A's, Carnegie Mellon, got accepted to Yale University for a PhD program. Oh, thank you. Thank you. And in 2009, I actually did graduate from Yale with a PhD, and my dissertation was a new theory of human intelligence. So now I've seen through personal experience, as well as lots and lots of research, just how many kids really are falling between the cracks. I think that if we're ever going to get the best out of students, we need to really understand this coexistence of ability and disability, not treat them as opposites, not have gifted education here and special education here, and set up this false dichotomy in our school system that we only have these 2 binary characters, these 2 binary categories. I think in order to really see the true possibilities in all students, we need to have a theory of intelligence that is holistic and really takes into account and appreciates the whole person. Thank you so much.
I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel inspired. And unfortunately, it is oftentimes about a piece of paper. So as we look at this twice exceptional child, the possibility of it, the holistic thing, here are some ideas, things that you can do at home, okay, with these children. Nurture their creativity by identifying individual strengths and interests. So you're going to provide them with opportunities to look at the real world concerns, right? Explore their interest areas through independent investigation at school and at home. Ask them questions, see what they're interested in, have them find out new knowledge. And not only does this help them develop that passion, but it can help them develop organizational systems that meet their needs. And when they're home and they develop it, it's very non-threatening. It's very comfortable. The third bullet, encourage them to take up a sport, go for a run, take up a creative endeavor, have them do something that will help them focus, be calm, center themselves so that they have coping mechanisms during times of high stress. Then be sure to provide support, understanding that sometimes the 2E student may perceive that support as pressure. Now, that's interesting. You've got to provide the support, but sometimes children say, wow, they expect too much out of me, and they end up shutting down or stepping away from things. So there's that happy medium. But if it all goes back to communication, talk to your child. How do you feel when I say this? What does it make you think of? Right? So you're focusing on multi aspects. Now, I know that we've covered a tremendous amount tonight. I hope I've given you some things to think about. I do want to say a special thanks for Daphne Perellis and the article that you see down at the bottom. Much of the information comes from that article. I will be sharing all those resources with you. This is my email address. Please email me if you have questions, if I can help in any way. I would love to be able to do that. tracy.inman@wku.edu. So after we've talked about it, you'll have the PowerPoint that you can look at and kind of think through again. I will send you the list of characteristics through JCPS, and I will also send you the article. Then you'll have this video to watch as well. We do have some time. Are there questions that I could answer for folks?
But I had the experience of working with a lot of 2E students in an all-day gifted center. And everything you hit on today is absolutely imperative for parents, particularly the team approach and going into those IEP meetings, knowing that your child has these extraordinary abilities on top of the potential disabilities, but being an advocate for your child and making sure that your voice is heard, that your child's voice is heard, and bringing some of the experiences that you might see at home. With your example of Lance, the teacher's not going to know about, like you said, the science investigations that he has going on in his classroom, but making sure that the teachers and that team is aware of it and making sure his needs are met on both sides of that bell curve that were referred to in the video is absolutely imperative. And I'm so thankful that you hit on the social emotional side of it. That's a huge passion of mine in general, particularly for gifted students.
Yes.
Because having done this, not as long as y'all at WKU, but having lived in the gifted world for 18 years and hearing, well, they're gifted, they're going to be fine.
Ugh, yeah.
That's not always the case.
Exactly.
By any means. And, in my previous experience with this, having to provide that counseling service and that one-on-one and those resources for those students, because they are at a cognitive level, they're very high, but some of their emotional level, it has not caught up to their cognitive level. And that is very disconcerting for a young child or even a high schooler, because they don't know how to necessarily regulate their emotions, and they don't know why it is that they're feeling the way that they're feeling sometimes. So sharing the links is going to be very helpful for parents, but just you telling them, be that voice for them, make sure that it is a team effort. And I like when you said that the IEP has more teeth than the GSSP, because that is, even in Florida where I came from, where gifted fell under IDEA, same thing. We always went to the IEP with our gifted. Yes. Just because, again, it had more weight to it and it had more backing to it. But we absolutely down there made sure that our gifted goals were on that IEP and were included.
Yes,
because
so important.
Yeah, it was there and it had to be followed. So I'm very appreciative of everything WKU is doing for us. Very appreciative of this seminar. Again, it just speaks volumes, because between social emotional and 2E, those are two of my huge passions in the world of gifted. I think because I've seen so much of it and I've experienced it.
Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned, that those are, the majority of phone calls I get deal with social emotional issues. And it's not that gifted children have more dysfunction with social emotional, they don't have more diagnoses or things like that. There's just an intensity with gifted children. And I think as parents, how our kids are feeling, how they process the world, how they handle frustrations. I mean, that's just paramount to us. So the more we know as parents, the better off we can advocate for our child. And that is so very important. So the resources that I will share with you guys, for example, there's a 2E newsletter that's out there that's terrific. Saying Gifted. I don't know if you're familiar with the social emotional needs for the gifted. Jesse, I know you are. The folks in the audience might not, but saynggifted.org, it all focuses on social emotional issues. You can go to their library there, and there's a whole section just with Twice Exceptional, a whole section just on perfectionism, all these different areas that we deal with. But unless you know about it, you can't access the resource. I also want to point out to you the National Association for Gifted Children, that's nagc.org. They have tip sheets for parents, and they deal with twice exceptional children, perfectionism, asynchronous development, a lot of these things that our kids are dealing with. And the tip sheet is just a front and back, very powerful, short place to get information with resources, the most frequently asked questions, and they're all by experts who specialize in that one particular area. So there are great resources out there. You just need to know where they are.
I went ahead and included saynggifted.org, nagc.org in the chat. Also, I've been a huge follower of the Davidson Institute also. They have some parent resources.
Oh, they've got great ones, you're right.
But just like you said, any the more knowledge we have, the better we're going to be able to advocate for our children.
Exactly.
And that's exactly.
And hopefully we are teaching our kids to advocate for themselves, but when they're little, that's not possible. And advocating is scary. It is. I look back on my own children, and Once Twice Exceptional, and I wish I'd done more of it. You're afraid to rock the boat. You're afraid, they know what they're doing. Do I know? So, you've got to realize this is the only time your child's going to be in third grade or biology or whatever it's going to be. And you've got to help make that the best experience it can be. And coming from the teacher side of it, I loved it when parents worked with me, when they teamed with me. And it's not that they came saying their kids are bored, you don't want to alienate people, but you form those partnerships because teachers want what's best for kids too. So that partnership is critically important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Inman, for your time this evening.
My pleasure.
I did let them know that I would be posting the handouts and any links that you have available in the comments section. So the video usually goes up by the next day. So those links will also be available for those in attendance. And if you are re-watching this, you may also drop notes in the chat, and I am able to see them during the rewatch, and I can answer back. So again, thank you, Dr. Inman, for this evening. And with that, we will go ahead and we will end